Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
We're delighted to be working with the Advertising Association on a series of workshops and debates exploring the role of advertising in influencing good behaviours. So tonight, in our first public event together, we brought together a fantastic panel of speakers to look at how the role and value of advertising have evolved since the days of Mad Men, and in particular how the consumer relationship with advertising has changed, especially with the advent of new forms of communication.
I was asked to talk about how the industry has changed since the days of Mad Men. And my first response to that is that Mad Men's a drama and not a documentary, and the industry has profoundly changed since the days of Don Draper. Now, hopefully, I'm a living example of how the industry has changed. As a Jewish woman from Manchester, I think that my employment prospects at Sterling Cooper would have been somewhat limited. Mad Men alludes to the slipping away of an old order and the rise of the new. And in the 60s, the industry in the UK and the US changed completely as society changed. And at that time, the Madison Avenue institutions of JWT and McCann were WASP institutions. In fact, there was an old joke that you needed to actually have a trust fund income in order to be able to afford to work at JWT. However, those fortress-like agencies were challenged by plucky new entrants like Doyle, Dane and Burback, who brought a Lower East Side hustle and a European-influenced design to a staid Madison Avenue. Burback's work reflected the rising aspirations of the Kennedy and civil rights era. His famous work for Levi's Rye Bread in some ways reflected back the changing face of America. This advert featured a black child eating a sandwich, and having black kids in a mainstream advert for what was a niche Jewish product shocked some, but spoke to the dawning of a more liberal age. Now, in the UK in the 1950s, the traditional ad man was a minor officer who'd had a bloody good war. And these individuals were replaced, quite pleased, by pushy working-class kids like David Putnam, Alan Parker, Frank Lowe, and of course the Saatchi brothers. And their work at CDP in the 60s spoke to an irreverent, socially mobile culture where people didn't know their place. And in their work, the upper middle classes are frequently lampooned as feckless. Do you remember the work for Harvey's Bristol Cream, or their later work for Heineken? These young Turks laughed and parodied the establishment just as fiercely as that was the week that was. And what both of these examples show us is advertising's role as cultural signifier, not cultural shaper. They send out signals of how our society is changing, and that signal reflects and does not refract. And as the 20th century was the American century, it is fair to say that the 80s in the UK was the Saatchi decade, and their work most accurately reflected the surface of our changing society. They started the decade in 1979 with Labour Isn't Working, and closed the decade in 1989 with the British Airways face. The BA face advert was a signifier of a more confident, shiny and sophisticated British corporate sector, ushered in by Thatcher. And in some ways, the Thatcher era came to a demise, not with her end in '89, but with John Major's devaluation in '92. Hundreds of thousands were stuck with negative equity, life felt grotty, and we all listened to grunge. Now, this era was dominated by a new wave agency, Howell, Henry, Chalcott, Lurie, and they were, in my opinion, the first truly postmodern agency, a mixture of posh boys and working-class kids. They had the first black creative director. They were eclectic. And their work, which others aped, was stripped down, first like ads like First Direct and Ronseal, but also highly irreverent, remember Tango. And their working processes of hot desking or creative collaboration with clients and the use of anthropologists was also copied by the competition. The noughties in many ways is quite hard to typify because of the enormity of the financial crisis, which had a profound effect on how we all see the world. Which brings us to today. And I would argue that the deluge of nostalgia-driven advertising speaks to a sense of loss in the UK right now. M&S, Sainsbury's, and even Virgin have all run anniversary ads. And I think that that's culturally significant for a number of reasons. First, the credit crisis was a crisis of trust. In fact, the Latin derivation of credit is actually trust. Institutions we were told to trust gambled our money away. And this didn't just create a crisis in trust in banks, but in all business. Hence why we see companies today reminding us of how long they've been around. Second, if you look at the Virgin Airways ad with its nostalgic parody of the 80s, it's reminding us of a more glamorous, carefree past. And we can also see real nostalgia for the 80s today in things like fashion with the bright colours or in the big sunglasses that we're choosing to wear. Because in an age of austerity, we demand glamour, even if it is from the faded past. When I became IPA president, I said that there was great nostalgia within the advertising industry, and that's because people were scared of the future. And when we're scared, we look to the past, to programs like Mad Men. Now I look to the future, and I'm excited by what we see before us. And I think we're about to enter a new golden age. Now, much has been made about the impact of digital on our business, but all the other evidence suggests that it doesn't destroy jobs in our industry, but creates more as there's more channels to communicate. And this observation has been validated by the London School of Economics. In addition, I think that the new communication channels like social media in actual fact complement old media like television. And I think one of the most interesting complements is between Twitter and television. And we know from our own experience that if we see a bad ad or a TV program, it's likely to get talked about by our friends on Twitter. But this is just touching the surface of how technology is changing all our lives. With websites like Facebook and Twitter and Flickr, we're able to share information far more quickly. Just look at the role that technology has had in the Arab Spring, or slightly closer today with the demise of the News of the World. The transparency of these tools means that power is more distributed and it's harder to claim trust. If your brand screws up, it will be shared real time across the world. And I think this creates a more distrustful, less hierarchical society. And as society changes, so must the industry. And as IPA president, I'm excited by the innovation going on in agencies today, which are bringing together technologists with creators who are practiced in the more traditional advertising. And we're starting to produce vital, original, multi-platform work. And this makes me very excited and optimistic about our future. And as I look to the purpose of the industry, I think it will be radically the same. Advertising creates value for brands by providing information, but also by imbuing products with values and associations. That's what Don Draper did, and what we will continue to do. But how we do it will be different. Technology will play a greater role in creative origination and in creative distribution. It will continue to transform how agencies structure themselves. And as IPA president, I want the industry to be radically the same. I want us to radically reach out to adjacent industries like the games and entertainment industry. I want to develop bold partnerships around training with the likes of Facebook and Google. And if we do this, we'll be radically relevant. But there are some things that I want to say the same. A devotion to working in the best interests of our clients, a devotion to ensure that our advertising is decent, honourable and truthful, and that we respect the privacy and intelligence of our audiences. So looking at past, present and future, we can see that certainty is change, and creativity requires change. Our industry will be able to win the future, but only if we change. And if our industry becomes trapped by one group of people or one discipline, we'll fail. However, if we regenerate the gene pool and constantly seek new connections to adjacent industries, we'll be able to create a new generation of creative pioneers who will define our future today.
George W. Bush was not known for his wit, known for many other things, but he did produce one really remarkable line. You can fool some of the people all the time, and these are the people you want to concentrate on. And he did, of course, to huge electoral effect. And indeed, it is a suspicion that that maybe is what advertising has often done, namely to concentrate on the people that you can fool. Now, that's an unfair criticism, of course, and my own experience of advertising has been quite different, but to be fair and to be honest about this, advertising as I've encountered it, both as a practitioner and as a recipient and consumer, has had one overwhelming objective, the objective to sell the services, to sell the products of the client that's placing the advertising. And this objective, the assumption has been that it is best achieved by exposure and paying for exposure and indeed by creativity, to which you've referred. And both have been major factors. For example, spending a lot as you go into a recession to maintain the viability and the recognition of a brand. One obvious thing, the search for new creativity, which is very much at the front now, but a rather frustrating search just currently. In the United Kingdom, we spend about £18 billion, I believe, on advertising. But is it working? Now, I currently am chairman of Havas Media here in the UK, and Havas Media worldwide has completed 3 years of surveys of how consumers think about brands. And I thought it might be worthwhile just to share some of the really interesting findings that are coming out of this, because they do confirm that whatever else is happening, the relationship between brands and consumers bridged by advertising is changing, and changing very significantly. First of all, we find, this is across the world, that 2/3 of consumers say that they don't basically care whether a majority of brands survive or not. Why this disconnect? Why is it? Well, I would postulate briefly to you that there are 4 reasons for this. First of all, expectations and the nature of expectations. The research shows very clearly that people expect far more than price from products and services, more indeed than values. They value for money, that is. They want brands and the companies that stand behind brands to contribute to their sense of well-being. Now, well-being is an interesting and to some extent new word in this debate. Now, what engenders well-being? Well, one of the things that is important in engendering it is a sense that brands and companies are helping the environment. That's quite specifically stated, and it's a very important consideration. And secondly, that brands and companies are contributing positively to the quality of society, not just to the quality of life for an individual, but the quality of life to society as a whole. People expect brands and companies to do this, to contribute to this sense of well-being, to contribute to this quality of society. Indeed, the figure for the United Kingdom is 73% of the people we talk to who believe that that is something companies and brands should do, and that they should be very clear about what they're doing. Thirdly, people are skeptical, so that, for example, in the United Kingdom, 65% of respondents said that they thought the motivation for people and companies and brands who are trying to improve the quality of society is essentially selfish. It is to demonstrate their own commitment and sincerity, and thereby make themselves more acceptable to society. So there is that skepticism. That skepticism is not universal at that level across the countries that we covered. And it is very interesting to me, I must say, and surprising, that the highest expectation about the societal contribution of brands and companies is in China and India. And it is at its lowest in the United States of America. And then the final point I want to make, the 4th factor for this disconnect, is of course the total change in the technological landscape. The fact is that interactive media, digital media, social media, its success is based not just on dexterity of a younger generation, it's also based on, if you like, a philosophical approach. That young people really do believe that you interrogate authority, you interrogate opinion, and indeed you get the confirmation of what is being claimed for products and services from your own peer group. And that's what a lot of social media is actually about. So, John Maynard Keynes was once asked, when he was accused of inconsistency in his economic theories, that he had changed his mind. And J.M. Keynes replied, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" And I think what we have to do in looking at the future of advertising and its relationship with the consumer is to acknowledge that very important facts have changed, that they are likely to continue changing, and therefore, perhaps we should change our mind about the role and the contribution of advertising.
My analysis of this subject comes from different areas. I suppose I have two areas which may qualify me as an expert in a sense. One is that I wrote a book about the kind of so-called Mad Men era of the British advertising industry, and really the men who kind of shaped the creative revolution that took place between the 60s and the 80s. And my other qualification is that I must have been one of the most sedentary and lazy children of the 1980s, and therefore spent so much time consumed by watching television and therefore advertising, that I had a very strong relationship with the ad break when I was a young man, and that's obviously changed. And so in my sort of analysis of this subject, how our relationship has changed with advertising over time, I kind of I've looked back at the people I met and the things they told me when I was researching the book Get Smashed, and how things have changed since then that have changed my perspective on advertising. The guys who I interviewed were all of those guys that Nicola mentioned, Ridley Scott, Alan Parker, David Putnam, Frank Lowe, the guys who kind of burst into the ad scene in the sort of late 50s and early 60s and overtook what was a very moribund industry run by waspish ex-army officers. And they were fascinating guys to speak to. There was three things that struck me about all of them. They had all been hugely determined, massively talented, and almost psychopathically ambitious. It was almost terrifying to hear the way that they tore into the business when they were younger. And it was fascinating to hear that a lot of them weren't really educated. They were from fairly kind of normal working class backgrounds, but they did know that they didn't want to continue the tradition of just going into whatever industry it had been that their fathers had worked in. But there was nothing really around for them that they found compelling and that they could make lots and lots of money out of, which was very important to all of them, even when they were quite young. And so they almost single-handedly worked their way up from the post rooms of these big ad agencies and single-handedly created an industry, not seeing one that was sort of acceptable to them. They more or less tore down the existing advertising industry and built it again in a shape that they found more agreeable. And what they then did to make the British advertising industry so massively successful was that they started to make advertising that wasn't based on the hard sell. It wasn't based on kind of treating consumers as idiotic drones, but it kind of spoke to them on an emotional level. And it was kind of, the great advertising of those 3 decades was quintessentially British, and they kind of harnessed a colloquial tone of voice, and there was an earthiness and an authenticity to it. And I think really that was the magic that they created and that really spoke to all of us. Then we get on to my relationship with advertising in the 80s, and it kind of really made sense because they made such a big deal out of being normal guys from normal backgrounds who are writing ads for normal people just like them. And because they approached it in that way, everyone sort of, during that era, when, remember, there was only 3 television channels, and one of those was, ran ads, and so we're kind of watching, we all share in the experience of the same ad campaigns night after night. So as a young man growing up, I would see these ads, and you would go into the playground the next day, and they were part of your life, and you would discuss them with your mates just as you would discuss what had been on Top of the Pops or what film that you'd seen in the cinema at the weekend. And of course, it goes without saying, everyone in the playground would also get up and sing Umbongo, Umbongo, they drink it in the Congo, and we all knew all the words to that verbatim. Funny enough, I spoke to some of the guys before this event and made that point to them, and they said an ad like the Umbongo campaign would never get through all the regulators nowadays because, of course, there's been such tight restrictions now on advertising junk food and the like to kids. And also, of course, the fact they drink Umbongo in the Congo is almost certainly factually incorrect. But in those days, you could get away with that sort of thing. So anyway, the conclusions are, why is it that nowadays no one's singing Umbongo, Umbongo, they drink it in the Congo, or its modern equivalent in the playground? Why are there no ad campaigns or advertisements that seem to sort of touch us all in the same way and that we all understand and seem to speak to all of us? And we don't have that kind of relationship that previous generations did with the ad break. Well, the conclusions I drew in my book, which I assumed still, would make sense today, is that first of all, that kind of earthiness, that authenticity, that colloquialism, that quintessential Britishness that they harnessed and that spoke to us so powerfully is no longer possible in a globalized market where there are huge international networks of ad agencies working for international brands, and those kind of ads that are that parochial are few and far between. Therefore, you get kind of homogenized generic creativity that doesn't have such a sort of a resonance or a poignancy. Also, for the same reason, there's digital fragmentation. So whereas before we'd all be watching the same channel every single night and seeing the same ad break, and it would therefore, we had that unified experience, that no longer exists. There is no ad that all of us have seen anymore because we're all consuming our entertainment through so many millions of different means. And then, of course, there is the idea that, there are other things that fill that gap in us. Those ads, like, Accrington Stanley, who are they, and all that sort of stuff that you used to kind of repeat ad nauseum in the playground when I was a kid. That is now fulfilled by the kind of virals that kids send around to each other on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it. And so that has filled that void. Now, advertisers for, the last few years have been trying to make their own versions of that. And it strikes me that the worst thing that can work against anything being viral or successful or speaking to audiences in the same way is it having any connection with a commercial brand. Not because I think people are necessarily hostile to commercial brands or think that they're, all part of some sort of terrible, sinister global conspiracy, but because there is something more exciting and warm to imagine that the things that you're watching that are entertaining to you and speaking to you are being made by another young person about your same age just on their Mac in their bedroom on the other side of the world. And the moment you discover it is, in fact, is the product of like a huge company who are in a fancy office in Los Angeles or New York or somewhere, it kind of undermines that sort of earthiness and authenticity, which are words I keep using because I think that that was the strength of advertising and the reason that we used to have an emotional connection with it that perhaps is less prevalent today. This sounds like I'm down on advertising, but my conclusions in the book and my conclusions today is that if advertising is ever at any point in its history been half a yard behind the zeitgeist or half a yard behind what people find enjoyable or half a yard behind paying dividends for their clients, it's only a matter of time before they succeed, before they turn that around. Advertising is too full of talent, too full of money, too full of determination, and the stakes are far too high for themselves and their brands for them ever to fail at anything. For people in advertising, my experience of advertising means it's, like I say, the level of ambition and the level of determination and level of creativity is awe-inspiring, and if ever there's any flaw in the industry, it is so quickly eradicated that it's almost terrifying.
To what extent do you think that advertising relies upon the idea of improving living standards? To what extent is it held up by that idea, by that kind of aspiration? And the reason I say that is because we are starting to dawn on us that not only is it the case that a lot of people haven't really enjoyed rising living standards for some time now. It was hidden, of course, by the fact that we all individually, collectively, publicly went into deep debt. But if you take that out of the equation, living standards have been pretty much stagnant, and they're falling faster this year than they have done since the early 1970s, and there's not much prospect of them picking up dramatically in the next few years. So starting with you, Nicola, to what extent is it, if we are in a kind of sustained period of flat living standards, does that take the oomph out of advertising, or does it just kind of change its context?
I think for me that it starts with an assumption that advertising is just a tool to promote consumption. And actually, it is a tool to do that, but also it's a tool that can actually promote not doing as much as something as well. So in the case of some of the COI work that we saw, reducing people drinking, reducing people, not wearing to wear their seatbelts, or different things where actually you can look at it in different ways. But I think advertising does reflect the society of the day, and I think advertising and the messages it carries on behalf of the brands need to be mindful that not everybody can always have the new shiny things out there, and to be sensitive to it. And that's why I think you've seen a different sort of advertising recently in terms of, feed your family for a £5, weekend foods for a tenner. These are great, simple campaigns that have been very effective, that have addressed the needs of the consumer, but have also been profitable for the organisations as well. So I do think it reflects the mood, but I think the creativity is a different sort of creativity.
First point, I think, from the way I look at it, is that historically advertising becomes obsessed about certain themes from time to time. And I've lived through at least 3 periods in which the obsession of advertising was detergents. And if you remember when this started, it was all about people who looked like rocket scientists walking around kitchens with needles going like that and so on. Then there was the amazing episode of Omo Power, which some of you may remember, which was going to revolutionize detergents, and it did indeed obliterate dirt. Unfortunately, it went on to obliterate everything else, like polka dots and stripes and so on. The detergent obsession may well come back, but it's not very strong currently. Rising living standards. Well, I believe that a lot of advertising is about aspiration. And you have to ask what people aspire to, and whether people aspire simply to a greater accumulation of material goods, I think, is now much more of an open question. And that's what we found with this Havas research, which I briefly described. I mean, there was no doubt that what was coming back was that people wanted brands and products and services to contribute beneficially to the quality of society. That's what people were saying. Now, of course, one of the ways in which you have to communicate that societal benefit is through advertising. And I think we will see a great deal of creativity beginning to focus onto that and the sense of well-being. We've got to be a bit careful about this living standard thing. We are in a financial crisis. Yes, indeed, we are in a financial crisis. But there is no real evidence that living standards are falling. Living standards have flattened. And it's a complex picture, not a simple picture. So it's not a wartime situation. And we're not on the, on the edge of rationing. We're actually looking at remarkably high overall standards of material life. There's a lot more inconvenience, there's a lot more difficulty, and there is to a degree an increase in unemployment. But I don't see that fundamentally affecting things. I think the switch is going to come much more in terms of what you're actually trying to sell people about a product and a service. And that may be more about soft values and the societal benefit than other things.
Sam, what do you think? Do you think individual adverts that you loved rode on the crest of the wave of a kind of general sense that in the end we would all have more and more and more stuff as we got older?
No, I think that people characterise the 80s, like, as a kind of an era of massive, material consumption.
Yeah.
But they just choose to, that's just the thing that people say, and they kind of, so if you're talking about ads, you'll choose to look at the famous VW ad with Paul Hamilton in it, or the silly Nescafe Gold Blend yuppie couple, instead of the Accrington Stanley ad. I mean, I think it might be a myth that ads are always about sort of developing this kind of high-rolling, consume more idea. The main thing it reminded me when you asked that question, though, was, I don't know if any of you look at the Daily Mash website, but in the midst of the financial crisis, they did a great headline. I'll paraphrase it, much less funny than they did it, but it was basically like, British public face up to having to do without some of the useless crap they don't really need for a few years, And they did a long article about how, we'd all got so used to spending money on things like scatter cushions or nice door handles, or like asparagus from Israel or something, and that really all people were going to have to sacrifice was that crap, and that really not really a financial disaster. I thought that was quite funny. The other quote is, which is from the first episode ever of Mad Men, and again I paraphrase, but he gives a sort of a stirring presentation to his clients where he says, what we're doing is telling people it's okay, you're normal, And I think, and Nicola sort of touched upon it, is that what advertising has always done and does in particular now is, yes, it is about aspirations, but the aspirations don't necessarily have to be about increased or decadent material consumption. The aspiration is just to feel like you're normal and that the life you are leading is not a depressing one, and it can be fun, and it's certainly not out of the ordinary. So when you have ads that say things like feed your family for a £5, it's basically addressing the reality of people's lives and telling them, you know what, it's okay. And I think advertising has always done that very well, and I think it does it particularly well now.
Where is the creativity coming from now? Because I suppose what's interesting about advertising is that the real value in an advert is the intuitive leap that is taken by the creative, and all the filming, all the stuff that goes in is secondary to that creative leap. Now, of course, because of social media, because of YouTube, because of the fact that anyone can get a flip cam and do their own filming in their bedroom, that that ability to have that kind of intuitive leap is open to any of us. And of course, you can go on YouTube, and there are people who are having those kind of brilliant ideas. And are we seeing the democratization of creativity?
Well, the stakes are higher, aren't they? Because of course there was a period where, you know, there would be ad creatives who would, you know, it was kind of like they somehow convinced, you know, clients for many years, certain ad creatives, that they had some kind of creative alchemy, and almost anything they said, you know, these were the chosen few, this select bunch of people who were the only ones who had the kind of, you know, the creative insight to sell your products. And now, of course, for the reasons that you say, because of the technological kind of democratization of creativity, you know, the bar's been set much higher. It's much difficult for you to cut through and sort of do something that's really going to wow a client or wow an audience, you know, because there is so much creativity out there, and so it's really, really hard to cut through. Where is the creativity coming from? I don't know, because I don't work in the industry, but it does occur to me that the sort of people I was speaking about earlier who featured in my book were kind of people who just had this, like, they didn't really know anything about advertising until they came to it and sort of made it all up as they went along. And now I think it must be much harder. You know, there are all sorts of courses, and people kind of come into the industry with the burden of all that history behind them rather than starting the blank sheet of paper. And with all the, like, you know, this huge kind of amount of amazing creative endeavours that are out there in front of you, and you're the one having to try and cut through all that and capture people's attention. Sounds like a much tougher job than it did for those guys I mentioned earlier, you know, in the early 60s.
Nicola, what's actually happening? I mean, is it the case that more ideas that are emerging through advertising are simply things that are being sent in because people have worked on them in their bedroom and they've done a 60-minute clip and they've sent it in? I mean, is more content coming from the streets, or is it still people who are called creatives wearing particular kind of creative clothes?
I think what we're seeing now is that creativity is coming from a much wider base. In the past, it really was the preserve of those kind of funky guys that sat in the big offices and sort of had the long lunches, etc. That's gone. But we're seeing creativity coming from the strategists. We're seeing creativity come from the technologists. We're seeing creativity come from data. And actually what I'm seeing more than I've ever seen before in recent times, and one of the reasons I'm very optimistic, is that there are a lot of firsts going on. A lot of people doing things together with different partnerships that you go, that's an amazing idea, I wish I'd have thought of that. Where brands are coming together with channels, with social media, and doing things that I think are exciting people in a way that I think we haven't seen for maybe 15, 20 years. So I'm very encouraged by what we're seeing.
And Alan, tell me, because your experience in the business, how does it work? You know, you get someone who's 25 or whatever, they have a brilliant idea, it creates a national campaign, and the assumption is they'll be able to carry on doing it through their career. There must be people who just have one good idea and they're going to live on that for the rest of their life. I mean, it must be harder now to live on your one good idea.
It's certainly true. I can think of a lot of them. And sometimes the one idea wasn't as good as you thought it was at the first unveiling. I think the hard fact, though, is that if you are presenting competitively to a client, to a company, the creative idea is, in my experience, still critical. And you still go through this thing of here's one, you know, one approach, and here's another one, and here's another one, and which gets you. And you pretty well always know, in my experience. I mean, there's something, you know, crosses the eyes of the client, and you know you've actually hit it. And equally, and that's dispiriting, of course, you know when you haven't hit it. And it's not the result of a process. It usually is a spark. It's something which is an invention. It's the ability to experiment. And I, however, would like to very much back something you just said, which because I think it's going to become more and more important. There will be a lot of creativity around strategy, around media strategy, around the mix of media, actually charting the journey to decision by a consumer or indeed a citizen, and seeing how you nudge that decision as it goes through the process. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, and there will be, I'm very aware of the people I work with, there are an awful lot of people who have come basically to this whole area through, in a way, being techies. And then suddenly they get it, that actually it's not just about the technology, it is at the end of the day really about creativity through the technology. And the moment that connection is made, you get some extraordinary things. So I'm rather optimistic about it.
One of the examples that is often given by them, I must have heard it about half a dozen times in this room, is the fact that if you tell people that something is 95% fat-free, it's substantially better than saying it's 5% fat. Now, this is just a simple example that is given. But the point I'm asking is that as this kind of, you use the word nudge yourself, as we understand behavioral economics, we understand social psychology, we understand how our brains work, we understand our cognitive frailties, and therefore, as it were, we understand a little bit of how advertising works, what does that do to advertising? Does it make any difference? I mean, I had a debate with David Willits about all this once, and he said, look, we know that the sun doesn't go around the earth, but we still talk about the sun rising. You know, so in a way, it doesn't really matter what we know. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't affect the way in which things have an impact on us. But do you think it does? As we become more sophisticated and understand how advertising preys on our cognitive frailties, does it change the challenge for advertising?
I think it does change it. And it is part of this greater knowledge and awareness on the part of consumers. You know, again, I referred to in the research that the degree of skepticism and the willingness to challenge the advertising assertion. And so therefore the way you get to consumers needs to demonstrate that you actually do understand, but not in an exploitive way, but you understand because it is the precondition of communicating really where they're coming from. And I think one of the big changes which social media in particular has begun to introduce is something that affects tonality. Politicians are having to learn this in a very difficult way, but they are learning it as well, is that people are looking for legitimacy in the communication. And legitimacy does require things like a certain transparency, a certain willingness, openness to admit problems and to talk about them. And I think that's part of the maturity, if you like, of advertising. There's one last thing, if I could just throw in about this, when we were talking about the impact of creativity in advertising. I, at one stage as a journalist, was very involved in looking at the collapse of Eastern Germany. And one of the reasons for the collapse of communism in Eastern Germany was that the authorities couldn't stop Western television being viewed across the DDR. And there was an absolute fixation on the part of people in Eastern Germany with the advertising that they were watching. And they watched the advertising, first of all, to measure living standards. It was actually a measurement of living standards, the size of the car, the number of rooms in an apartment, and so on. But secondly, they were very, very tied into the idea of what is the aspiration that lies behind the advertising. And I think that we have to revisit the question of not just the consumer's aspiration, but also our aspiration. And if the aspiration is simply, or the ambition, if you like, to sell as much of a product or a service as fast as you can, it's an inadequate aspiration. And in the end, it won't do the industry much good.
Nicola? How do you think our awareness that advertising is not simply responding to our revealed preferences, but is shaping our preferences is going to do to the way advertising works?
I think it starts with a belief that advertisers almost have a Rasputin-like power. But I just don't think that's true. I would agree with a lot of what you were just talking about in terms of we will shape and change because we always have done. But I also think that there's a point that we actually also want to, we look to advertising, we look to other things in culture where we can get a little bit of hope. And I don't want, and advertising provides us choice. It's the reason we have so many different media channels, because advertising fuels it. It's the reason that the Eastern Europeans wanted to have more than blue eyeshadow, because the women wanted to have green, have brown, or whatever it was that we were telling them at the time. And it's the reason that I'll spend £200 on a dress when I could go and buy a very similar dress for £10, because it makes me just feel a little bit more different, interesting, bolder, whatever the reasons are. And I think it's a very complicated thing, that the brain and its relationship with culture and its relationship with society today and advertising. And I think we are only just beginning to learn more and more about it. But what I love about this industry is is always curious. Every time we find something new out, we go, okay, we found that out, how are we going to change now? What are we going to do to learn from that and adapt in a different way? And as long as it continues to be as excited about the new things out there, I think the advertising, and I think consumers will be happy to embrace the advertising that we come up with.
What do you think, Sam? How do you think our awareness of what advertising is trying to do to us does to advertising's power?
Yeah, I kind of think that that's gone back for like a century. There was a book called something like the Dark Manipulators, the Hidden Persuaders. But there was numerous other books along those lines.
Vance Packard, what was famous about that book was it was about subliminal advertising. So,
yeah.
And its power was that it said, there's a secret thing going on in advertising that you don't know about.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is that we kind of understand that all advertising is subliminal advertising. I mean, that's the idea. The idea that some advertising is subliminal and some's not. That, I mean, all advertising works at an emotional level, and we're becoming aware of that.
Yeah, it's at an emotional level, but I think that to suggest it's in some way manipulative or there is any dark arts behind it, from my experience of meeting the guys who made it, you know, the famous ads and speaking to people about it, you know, I don't buy that, and I think that content is king, and I think regardless of the way in which the media has changed, I think actually, although as I said earlier, it must be much harder to have creative ideas that cut through, you know, the ads that are successful, not just in terms of selling product, but in just generating warmth towards them and popularity amongst the huge, and kind of uniting people, did you see that ad, are always the ads where there's just a simple idea brilliantly executed. And although it is much harder, for all the reasons we've discussed, two of the best ads that have been so much more talked about than any other ad campaign I can think of for like the last decade have been this year, I think. There's the Volkswagen Darth Vader ad, which is absolutely brilliant and has somehow cut through because people have seen it through so many different mediums that everyone talks about it and everyone loves it. And there's the Old Spice ad as well. You know, I'm on a horse. I mean, these are two of the best ads, you know, that I've ever seen, and they've both been in the space of this year, and they've both done that job of cutting through. And it's proved to me that content is king. And as far as the manipulation things goes, I just think they're simple ideas from people sitting around in a room, and it makes them laugh, and they suspect that it'll make other people laugh, and then as a result, people will feel warm towards that brand. I also think that the idea that ads are kind of manipulating you into thinking that you need more than you've got, or you should aspire to a more lavish lifestyle. The reverse is true of British audiences. If you look at the most popular ad campaigns in Britain, it's always the brands that present themselves in some kind of authentic and down-to-earth sense that seem to be the ones that people feel warmest to. In successive polls and public votes for the most popular ad campaign of all time, it was always the Mash Get Smash ads that came top. And Gray Jolliffe was the guy who wrote that ad, and he, like you say, when you say there's guys who lived off an idea for years, he himself would say, yeah, I was sitting around having a beer after hours and someone stuck their head around the door and said, we need a line for Smash. And he goes, what is it? And they said, well, it's this powdered mashed potato. And he goes, well, I don't know, for Mash Get Smash. And he says, and I made £1 million off of that moment. He said, and it's been voted every time the most successful ad campaign of all time. So that story alone shows the idea that any ad men are creeping around with their kind of dark powers of manipulation proves, in fact, they have good ideas that make them laugh in the office, and then it makes us laugh and everyone's happy.